And it begins with the realization that you were always meant to be poor. Now, I'm not talking about all by the standards of the great majority of human history. I'm not talking about the poverty of child soldiers in East Africa or starving North Koreans. No, you were meant to be poor in a very different way. You are the end result of decades of selfish and unwise decisions made by selfish and unwisely. You live a life of seeing YouTube is giving away millions to other millionaire YouTubers. You look at where these billionaires going to space, wondering how is it possible. You spend every day struggling to pay the rent, the bills, the debts, prices keep increasing, taxes keep hiking while your income is stagnating, and your time is wasting, living in dystopian. Set in Dallas with transient and habits and squabbling cheat by cheapest, while your only free time is spent being shot on a grindy slope, packed public transports through dangerous up and sprue, where you go home with just enough energy to mindlessly watch a drip, or empty entertainment. But any moments without the next dopamine hit is a moment wasted where you wake up in a pod and go back to work for the bidding of your corporate slave master, only for you to repeat the same cycle every day of every week of every month, every year. But it doesn't have to be this way. There is a formula mindset that will allow you to escape this trap. By the end of this video, you'll understand the subliminal mindsets and insidious indoctrination that stunted your development. But the thing is, this won't be easy. In fact, this video will require your total engagement. It requires learning some ugly truths that our culture hasn't told you. I know many of you will click off because of this. But for those of you who know that this isn't the life, those of you who want to escape, those of you who no longer go into what's life from the stacks, those of you who don't want to live through other people's stories, if this is you, then escaping this trap will change the trajectory of your life. At the end of this awaits of life that has been taken away from you. But if you're all ready, then we need to start peeling back the layers. What are your true passions? What do you want to get out of life? What motivates you to get out of bed? These are the questions you would never ask in school. Instead, you spent most of your lives desk learning to be mediocre, waiting for the next break, the next ring of the alarm to escape. The problem is that by living this lifestyle for most of your developing years, you were taught to never value your time from the start of your life. Your time was wasted at every second of the day. And with so much boring mass-produced phony education being droned at you all day, your only salvation was to waste even more time at home, time that should be spent playing with other children, being embraced by your community, and following your passion. And instead of this, you spent your entire days learning the guestbook fragments of education. In fact, this time is so pointless. The unschooled kids left alone with no education catch up completely with school children college. I think the way we do schooling is much more about daycare. And it's also preparing kids for the wrong things. I mean, 8 hours a day, 9 hours a day. It was a little group prison camp where you have to raise your hand to go to the bathroom, and they tell you how to think and how to behave. It's terrible. By being accustomed to this, following your passions, this life of never valuing your time, this life of unfulfillment and conformity, your mind starts to become lazy. The ambition and drive to follow your curiosity has been crushed, so you become a disciplined. Why would you want to put yourself through the pain of constant work, practice, and routine if there's no payoff at the end? What's the point of struggle without reward? By subconsciously adopting this mindset, you start to become devoid of passion and curiosity. Instead, you most likely instant gratification, passions, like video games, Netflix, social media, and vaping. This is why we live in a generation where almost everyone needs some sort of life coach or therapist to tell them what to do, because our education system has taken away the driving force that allows us to follow our destiny. We don't have that force, that burning desire to achieve our goals and become disciplined. So then you may be. How do you escape this mindset? What makes the elite so different? Where truth is, the rulers of our society have always had a very different life than you from birth. They resided on the other side of the city. They stand in the fast thing queues. They watch sports from the Skype boxes. They eat different foods from you, very different scores than you. They went to schools where they were actually given the time and attention to develop their innate special knowledge. They had the time and freedom to pursue their curiosity. They would train to become disciplines. They were indoctrinated into knowing that they would be at the tone. They didn't even need to do that well in school. They don't need to learn boring subjects that aren't careful. Instead, they learned to value that time, follow their passions, and from there, they were given very easy access into esteemed universities like Harvard and Yale. That's why almost all these children go to the best universities. Chuck Schumer and both of his children to Harvard. Obama sent one of his children to Harvard. Wickens, his daughter, went to Stanford, and I will go us and 4 of his children to Harvard. But for normal people like you, you'd have to be the brightest and most talented in your school to apply. And even then you don't only have a 3% chance of acceptance. And yet somehow, almost all the leaders can send that George North to Harvard. You show no sign of tons in anything. And so you see it's these differences in education that began to shape the growing class divide that we see today. It's wild leaders can no longer even understand the lives of the majority. And in 2022, these differences are beginning to have catastrophic effects in all of our lives. It's in these next chapters that you'll soon understand why you were never supposed to be rich. So fast forward a few years. And let's say you're a regular office worker. If you live in America, your average yearly wage is probably around $50,000 a year. You probably also work 40 hours a week and work 47 weeks a year. That means that you spend almost all your waking hours, all your most creative years, all your energy working to survive the next day. You have slowly become just another cog in the rat race, and by virtue of your schooling years and adopted, you were never meant to escape by design. As I mentioned earlier, you were taught to devalue a time. You were also taught the work is supposed to be boring and handed down to you by teacher or boss. However, by being accustomed to this way of thinking, you're destined to be poor and miserable because in reality, the time you spend walking has no real correlation to the money. If you have a corner shop, for example, when you're sweating and tiring it out, restocking shows, ordering deliveries, talking to customers, spending all hours of the day working, you're only achieving a fraction of what the other side of making. And the sad fact is that because you've never required the specific knowledge needed to provide value, you can be replaced by anyone. But this understanding that you can be replaced at any time, you continue to work day in and day out, neglecting your physical and mental health and losing your only life on this earth. As much as people like you have a muscle, it's a cleanse. They work 100 hours a week. The truth is that almost no human on this planet can work more than 3 to 4 hours a day. And I'm not talking about shadow work where you procrastinate for almost the entire day. I'm talking about what Cal Newport describes as a deep work, where you divert your pure undivided attention to a certain task. Almost no wealthy, powerful person does any more real work than this. And yet your slave and your precious time to make just enough to continue this dreary life. And this isn't a surprise since you've never been taught any other way of life. You've built up a lifelong habits of only working at 20% of your true capacity. You most likely waste 6 hours a day watching things that you don't care about, looking at posts that make you feel empty. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting thousands of dollars worth of your time. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're racing $50,000. And you are doing that right now. So we've established the reasons why your life has been so restricted. But even still, why is this problem so much worse today? Why are we seeing the antidote movements become so popular? I mean, the education system hasn't really changed in decades, and yet people are poorer than they were before. In other years, people's wages grew relative to their country's economic growth. So why is this no longer the case? And even more importantly, why is our society, it's brought into such a downward spiral? Well, stick with me here, as things were about to get a lot more interesting. Say by this point, you should understand the 3-year adoptive mindsets from school. You think conditioned to live a miserable life. A life without freedom, instead of inheriting your father's trades. Using a specific knowledge and time, you now work for someone else. You rent from someone else, and you have nothing to show for. You work for corporations that have amassed more power than countries, while you yourself have no power, while your subconscious outrage and despair is buried under an avalanche of cultural drivel. Shelley, are most of your income to live in a pod in a polluted megacity. Living in soda, alienating unaffordable decadent, deteriorating metropolises. But the question is, how did things get this bad? How did the average American wage stagnates, or the top 1% has accrued more wealth than at any other time in living memory? But at this point it goes way beyond just education alone. Because we have all been abandoned by leaders who abandoned the masses by to education and upbringing, abandoned by leaders through their reckless actions, through quantitative easing, money printing, and then fleet. Over 40% of all US dollars were printed in 2020. Which is why you might start to notice that life has become a lot more expensive. I mean, the total money supply has increased by 336% in the last year and a half. This is money that is printed out of nothing. And this is new. This dilating the value of every existing dollar you vans, and the truth is the situation is far worse than these numbers might suggest. In the last year, crude oil is up 55%, used cars have gone up in price, 32% beef prices have risen by 21%, lumber 35%, wheat 37%, sugar 33%, corn 39%, palm oil 43%, coffee 108%. It's 114%, and rent prices are up almost 23% in New York. Rent is almost tripled in California. In London, the mega-rich guitarists own more property than the Queen of England. It's so bad that for property to be affordable in London, the average worker's wages would need to increase by 266% just to catch up with inflation. It's gotten so bad that there are also that the rich no longer even have to look at the poor. That's why we're at a point where her literal cupboard under the stairs costs you almost $700 a month to live in. That's why shad pods with no privacy, no doors, and new ownership will cost you $12,000 a month to live in depressing, crummy apartments that attract nothing more than crime and degeneracy of the new homes for the masses. With all this inflation, with all this wage stagnation, it's absolutely no coincidence that we see the rise in cryptocurrency and NFTs. People are gobbling up Bitcoin is possible as a final refuge against this unprecedented inflation. People are buying up as much magic internet money as possible because our currencies have become valueless. And this is a sign of impending disaster on a societal and personal level, with massive inflation with no home, no community. This is what keeps you oppressed. You can't rise up in a society when the rules of the game are no longer. Even there is no such thing as equality of opportunity when the game has breathed against you from the start. And none of this is an accident. Family is freedom. Property is freedom. Community is freedom. And every second of the day, this is slowly being taken away from you. Our entire economy has become centered around a crony capitalist system that eviscerates the family, leading to misery, atomization, and extra-central despair. Don't just take my word for us. The Brookings Institute. Folding male wages led to a 20% reduction in marriage rates. When jobs shut down, marriage rates plummet. And at the same time, testosterone, sperm counts, and family are all crumbling into dust. Because by this point in our globalized, atomized, depressed, and lonely society, the elites no longer care for the population. They no longer care for the southern class. That's why wealth inequality is rampant. That's why we're seeing the end of the middle class. The backbone of democracy in Western civilization is being desecrated. Which is, the majority of households now qualify as low-income households. So the currency has been inflated to hide this deep-rooted economic problem. And at the same time, everyone is atomized, depressed, and lonely because thanks to the complete failure of hyper-capitalism to enrich Elijah with any purpose or meaning. We have to cope with all of this by numbing ourselves on drugs, liquor, and turning. But at least you can get the next Starbucks pumpkin latte, the next gadget, the next pill. At least you have the freedom to be a solar shell of a human being. At least you have the freedom to slave away at a corporate job to make ends meet. At least you have the freedom to waste your life watching an endless loop of nihilistic, barren distractions. All of this is happening because America and the UK now live in a new class system. No one likes to mention it. The media ignores it. Its YouTube has run away from it. But it's the ugly from the get-go. The rich have lived lives unfathomable to the majority. They have adopted esoteric mindsets that have allowed their curiosity and passions to thrive. They have been given the keys to the top universities that serve as a membership club and the elite. They have been given the resources, funds, discipline, and specific knowledge to generate. With this wealth, they have secured that freedom. They have secured that meaning and happiness. And most importantly, they've never lived in your shoes. They've never seen the love of the masses. They've never been through state's education. They've never been to the factories, the average universities, the meaningless, looping corporate jobs. They never lived in the port and the dangerous oven spools that define modern, in any normal society. This would have forced change in the status quo, but in our society, political parties have now merged into one, all merging into the same carbon copy replica of one another. There is no longer any healthy political discourse. Lawmakers, journalists, and business CEOs are all in the same. The elite's disconnection is then only further catalyzed by the isolation. The ruling class, it becomes so insulated that their failures are just openly ignored. And it's no exaggeration when I say that this is how great civilizations collapse. Great civilizations collapse when the leaders work against the interests of the people, and you're on the losing side of all of this from the beginning. You were never meant to be wealthy. And the sad truth is that you're just another statistic in a corporate bureaucracy. A statistic with no money, no savings, and no family. But on a personal level, you can escape the situation. You don't have to live like this. This whole situation changes when we each take on personal responsibility to attend to ourselves. If you want the freedom to raise a family, the freedom to escape corporate health and reinvigorate your psyche, you must begin to see work as play. You must decondition yourself from all these toxic mindsets sailed into you by state education, You need to build up the slow habits that will instill in you discipline. You need to cut out the sugar. Cut out the lethargic minus the constant social media driven. You need to reject the toxic junk that is continually stuffed into your psyche, constipating your creativity and potential. You need to play the game being played against you, because when you embark on a path of freedom, you become dangerous. And when enough people begin to take control of their lives, this will foster radical improvement. Of course, all of this, it's just when you've been numbed into flaccid apathy on a collective level. Does society become so stagnant and unequal? The formulas are formed, the formulas of freedom. The formula to happiness boils down to this: health plus wealth plus good relationships equals happiness. Focus on these three things. The things that have been destroyed in our society, destroyed by our leaders, destroyed by big tech. And I assure you, you will escape.